The next interview is from Peter Robbins, who was not witness to any of the Rendlesham Forest incident. He partnered with witness Larry Warren for many years and co-authored the book Left at Eastgate.
I had first heard about this in 1983 after Larry had gone public, and there were certain articles appearing about it.
The subject begins with the pronoun I. The pronoun I indicates linguistic commitment on the part of the speaker, and we can expect reliable information to follow. I had first. The use of the present perfect, had, adds the element of time to the sentence. First indicates that the speaker is thinking in logical sequence. Had first is also unnecessary wording, as the sentence would convey the same meaning and information to the listener if they are removed from the sentence. Unnecessary words are important to the speaker, therefore important to the analysis. This indicates closeness, as that indicates distance. Here we see that the speaker is linguistically close to what he had first heard in 1983. There was certain articles appearing about it. Adding the qualifier certain to articles is passive, as is using the term appearing. Passivity is used to conceal identity and/or responsibility. The word appearing also seems contrived in context to UFOs. There was certain articles. Certain articles indicates he was separating some articles from others in his linguistic reality, which indicates a certain sensitivity to them.
Interviews, quasi-interviews, the document known as the HALT document, the report that the colonel had filled out as a consideration to the Ministry of Defense, had gotten filed and later released, had come up.
When items are listed, analysts note the order. Here the subject begins with A. Interviews, B. Quasi-interviews, C. The document known as the HALT document, and D. The report that a colonel filled out. Often the speaker will list items in order of priority to themselves. It appears that interviews are the priority, followed by quasi-interviews, which would require the subject to explain what quasi-interviews means to him, and lastly, he lists the document associated to Colonel Halt. This may be a product of his association with Larry Warren and the distancing Larry Warren has shown towards things associated with things related to Colonel Halt from Larry's interview. Colonel Halt does not get a complete social introduction. This too could be a product of the point of Larry's distancing from things connected to Colonel Halt. It may also be that the audience has been introduced to Colonel Halt. It may be distancing language from Colonel Halt on the part of the subject, Peter Robbins.
So my interest was piqued. We had met very briefly in passing in 1983, but it wasn't something that had a tremendous impact on either of us. But 4 years later, in 1987, Larry was a featured lecturer at the 40th anniversary of the 1947 UFO sightings MUFON conference in Washington, D.C., and I was a panel member on a discussion on one of the evenings.
So my interest was piqued. Understandable that he would have an interest in Larry Warren's story for himself. Here Peter Robbins uses distancing and minimizing language. The qualifiers very and briefly and in passing are not required. Therefore the question of their initial contact may not have been cordial or elicited an unfavourable impression on the subject. It may also be need to persuade and have been more than a short connection. This is then bolstered by something that had a tremendous impact on either of us, a lot of words for an inconsequential meeting. Dates and times are always noted in statement analysis for possible impact on the language. Here the element of time is again repeated with the line starting with but. This word is strange here, as it is a word that refutes or minimizes what came before. It was the previous meeting he is refuting or minimizing. Time is important to Peter Robbins. More elements of time and another date. The meeting being brief and the lack of impact on them both is refuted or minimized by the word but. He minimizes or refutes both these statements back to back.
And we heard each other speak. We introduced ourselves to each other the next day.
The addition of the unnecessary words to each other shows sensitivity to their meeting. Introduced ourselves does not need the addition of to each other, as it is redundant. There may be something about the meeting that causes the subjects to be sensitive about his recollection of them meeting or his relationship with Larry Warren. Each other is also repeated in the same sentence, heightening the sensitivity. To each other, is this a demonstration of sensitivity and possible need to persuade that they needed to be introduced again after the first meeting? Is it a need to persuade that the first meeting was insignificant?
My attitude at the time was, this is an interesting guy, a military witness, somebody who's been through a debriefing, somebody who has been through this whole UFO situation in a military situation.
Why does the subject say attitude and not thought? Attitude is more an emotional state or stance or approach. The subject also qualifies this state with the element of time, at the time. This is a strong indication that his attitude changed from what it was beforehand. Peter Robbins describes Larry Warren as an interesting guy, a military witness, and twice as somebody who. While this seems like a normal description, it is a change of language. There is likely some emotional impact on the speaker which dovetails with his change in attitude towards Larry Warren. The subject brings 2 points of sensitivity into his language, the word whole and the repeated word situation. Attitude, unless stated as positive, the word attitude usually indicates negative. If a subject was to say they had an attitude, it would likely indicate it was negative. Teenagers are often described as such.
I wanted very much to do an extended interview with him.
Is this a need to persuade? Does the subject mean what he says? The subject uses unnecessary words, qualifiers, which show doubt to this assertion. Very much and extended interview. In communicative language, the shortest way to convey one's thoughts are the expected. Here, the shortest and simplest way to say the same thing would be, I wanted to do an interview with him. The addition of the qualifiers tells us the subject is sensitive to what he is saying, and they indicate the subject has a need to persuade us that this is the case. This often indicates the opposite. The subject distances himself not only from Larry, but from the decision to write the book.
I had no idea that Larry had already decided that he wanted me to work on a book with him. And I went into this genuinely having no idea of what I was getting into.
Okay.
Everyone has an idea. This is hyperbole. It is a need to persuade. While not a big point, it shows sensitivity to the topic. Larry had already decided that he wanted me to work on a book with him. This too supports the need to persuade and goes further by putting the decision in Larry's hands, thus distancing the subject from his participation. There is still more distance shown by the separation of the subject, Peter from Larry, with the word with separating the two. At this point in time, the subject shows reservations in working with Larry. To illustrate what this would look like in a clean, reliable sentence, I didn't know that Larry wanted us to work together on a book. This is a telling line from the subject. He adds more distance from Larry and tells us how he feels now is not the same as before. Is this an admission that he has doubts about the UFO story or working with Larry? Again, he says, no idea. Repeated words are noted for sensitivity and importance to the speaker. The addition of the qualifier genuinely may indicate he is not sure he would do the same, i.e. collaborate with Larry.
I think one of the things that we see when there is a scandal or a cover-up or whatever it is in secular life or political life is if the first person to come forward, the classic whistleblower, no matter how popular the cause or how noble the individual, folks tend to sit back and watch, waiting for them to either swing in the wind, get caught in a car crash or something, or vaporize themselves. Afterwards, people choose up sides, other people come forward.
Long sentences indicate that the subject isn't comfortable with the issue themselves and may be self-persuasion as much as trying to persuade others. This sentence is not only long, it is convoluted. This sentence also belies weakness of commitment on the part of the speaker. I think. When the speakers list items, analysts note the order, as order often indicates priority. The subject lists a scandal, a cover-up, or whatever it is. These three items give us a look into how the subject views his own narrative or story. The subject then lists secular life and political life. The use of the word secular is unexpected in this context. I think the expected would be private versus public, not secular versus political. Again, we get a glimpse of the subject's outlook via his linguistic reality. To the subject, is it important to be the first person? What about second or third? The classic whistleblower. The subject adds the qualifier classic to whistleblower. This word is unnecessary and indicates that the subject wishes to distinguish type. What does a non-classic whistleblower look like to the subject? No matter how popular the cause or how noble the individual. Here we have the subject building in an excuse, a self-protection against failure for being wrong. Again, an insight into his linguistic reality. Folks tend to sit back and watch, waiting for them to either swing in the wind, get caught in a car crash or something, or vaporize themselves. This provides still more insight to the linguistic reality of the subject. Does he feel persecuted? All his options for the results of being first as a classic whistleblower end with negative consequences. Does he know the event is not true as presented? Instead of standing on truth, the subject uses a long sentence to qualify his position. This makes his position weak. Folks tend to sit back and watch. The subject uses the soft, non-conditional folk instead of the expected people or public. Is the subject sympathetic to them for not doing more than sit back and watch? Linguistically, this is self-distancing from any event. Afterwards, people choose upsides, other people come forward. There is a change in language as folks become people. When there is a change in language, we look for a change in reality to account for the change. When there is no change in reality, we should be on the lookout for deception or narrative building and storytelling. Here, the language change may be attributed to upsides, whereas previously folks was associated with negative consequences. Folks sit and watch, people come forward. Is the subject giving us reason why folks tend to sit back? No matter how popular the cause or how noble the individual, the subject does not include whether the whistleblower is telling the truth. Is that not the most important factor? Yet it is omitted by the subject.
But groundbreakers are often the ones that are left to their own devices. Larry had no support. He was literally left swinging in the wind to a degree. Everybody wrote their interpretation of his story.
With the word but, the subject refutes or minimizes by comparison what came before. The subject separates Larry from the folks and people. Another change in language as whistleblowers becomes groundbreakers. This change is a more positive linguistic term than whistleblower, yet he goes on to change this language again to the ones, which in my opinion reduces the linguistic disposition back to a more neutral position. The subject appears to be linguistically conflicted by his own interpretation of the relationship between himself and Larry. The subject uses a number of unnecessary words. He could have conveyed the same information with groundbreakers are often left to their own devices. The words devices are the subject's language. It is fair to ask where this came from. Does he think there are devices at play with Larry or by Larry? Larry had no support. He was literally left swinging in the wind to a degree. The subject uses hyperbole, literally, and passivity. This presents a weak view of both the case and the author of the case, Larry. The subject increases this weakness by adding to a degree, which minimizes his claim. Everybody wrote their interpretation of his story. The subject allows for differing opinions. This is both weakness of claim and possibly a lack of belief on his part into the event.
Peter, this is a very interesting story. You've done a lot of research. Can you really back this up?
I can.
This is a good answer, short and lacks qualifiers. What isn't obvious is that he doesn't stop and he speaks over the next question in his answering of the second question. So his answer doesn't stop without qualifiers as he launches into a long explanation. This weakens his claim.
How can you?
If you remove Larry Warren from this, we have gotten a paper trail that runs back through all of the base public relations officers of denials, combined with at least half a dozen other witnesses' statements, combined with, well, for example, the soil analysis laboratory report, the fact that we've documented an earlier known incident of UFO incursion over this base as early as 1956, and a continuing high incidence of UFO phenomena in the southeastern corner of England over the years.
The subject goes into a long sentence. Truth stands on its own and usually does not include long explanations. If you remove Larry Warren from this, not only does the subject enter into a long sentence, he begins the sentence linguistically removing Larry Warren. This should be considered as distancing language from Larry Warren. This is passive language and could be used equally if one was to support or deny the claim. We have gotten. The subject uses the plural we, which can be appropriate, although it would be a stronger claim if he used the pronoun I, since he said earlier, I can. Using the plural is a way to distance oneself and crowdsource the claim. Gotten is also an unnecessary word. Simply stating we have or I have would be a stronger claim. Gotten also brings into his linguistic reality the thought process of attaining the documents, which then brings the question, why is the manner of getting the documents sensitive to the subject? The subject puts denials in his claim of proof of event. This is very unexpected and linguistically shows he may doubt his own story. The subject uses passivity and events that could be argued are either unproven speculation or could be interpreted as the opposite of the subject's claim. Passivity is used to hide identity and/or responsibility.
I'm sorry to say we've documented several suicides of individuals who were involved. Because of the Privacy Act of 1974, I don't know how much of that we'll be able to bring to light with all due respect to their families.
The subject pauses before continuing. This may indicate a need to process his thoughts. Then he goes to, I'm sorry. In statement analysis, sorry is always flagged. Even when it is appropriate in context, it can indicate an underlying remorse or guilt. Other words could convey the sentiment without using the word sorry. In this case, why does the subject need to say, I'm sorry to say? Did he cause them to commit suicide? I am not implying that he did, rather to illustrate how the word sorry can have deeper meaning to the speaker. The subject tells us why, because, to a question not asked. This indicates sensitivity and importance to the speaker in a need to explain. Here the subject makes an excuse for not telling us more about what he just said. This weakens the strength of his claims. The subject also states this in the negative, adding more sensitivity to his statement.
Peter, you were talking about you could back this story up with documentation. What else could you offer? Or is there anything you got
I look for things
today?
between the lines. Sometimes what is right in front of your face you discount the quickest.
You discount. Here the subject brings in the word discount in context to bolstering his claim. This is to give credence that his claim can be discounted. The subject also employs passivity in this sentence, further weakening or discounting his claim.
If this man in any way is shaped or been delusional here...
If this man. The subject avoids using this man's name. This is an indication of distancing from the man. This, which indicates closeness, is in this versus that, is still appropriate as this man is seated beside him. So there is no discrepancy with the subject using this closeness while distancing by not using his name. The subject again allows for Larry to be delusional. This is the subject's language and his choice to associate negative linguistic attributes to Larry and by extension his and Larry's claims. Not only delusional, but also in any way or shape, strengthening the negative attributes.
Number one, I have documentation through his mother, through independent witnesses, that the very next morning he called her. So if he's a liar, the first person he lied to was his mom, and he did it the next morning. If he's a liar, then one always has to be careful what one says about anyone's mother in this world.
Number one, the subject uses a numerical reference which denotes logical thought, and we should expect to find a number 2, 3, etc. It also indicates he has more than one thought when he states number 1. Note we don't get to a number 2. The subject presents his evidence as second-hand. Is he aware, if only subconsciously, that the evidence he stands on is weak? We can follow his words and see that he is distancing himself even as he claims, I have documentation through his mother. He does not say from, but through. This is subtle distancing. Does he believe what he says? His next lines indicate his own weakness in context. So if he's a liar, the first person he lied to is his mom. This is unexpected to have the subject refer to his partner Larry as a liar. Even as a hypothetical, it is a word he associates with Larry. This is not a good sign of a healthy relationship. The subject also repeats this hypothetical, if he's a liar. This comes from somewhere. He is not repeating someone else's words. These are his words, freely chosen.
His mother wrote back a letter within a day or two of Colonel Halt's report, confirming to the effect, yes, son, you saw a UFO and it must have been amazing.
The subject links Colonel Halt's report to Larry's mother's letter, but does not show a link. This is passive and weak, confirming to the effect, yes, you saw a UFO. Here we see more passivity and weakness. The subject does not say, Larry saw a UFO. The subject uses the universal you. This is supported by the subject's qualifying to the effect, which is unnecessary if Larry saw a UFO. This makes one question if Larry saw a UFO.
That Larry was so caught up in this continuing psychodrama that I don't even think he realized that maybe the worst place he could insist that he and his new wife go on their honeymoon was back to this little corner of England instead of somewhere in the Bahamas where she wanted to go.
Again, the subject adds language, this continuing psychodrama, into his narrative. These are his words, and he is using them in context of his partner in UFO research. This indicates a negative linguistic disposition towards Larry. With the words, I don't even think he realized, the subject supports the negative linguistic disposition as it puts Larry in an unflattering light.
There are lots of small things like this that I've gotten to know this guy pretty well over the last 6 years.
At best, small things like this is linguistically neutral to negative. This indicates closeness, and small things is often used to describe items of conflict or concern between people in a negative light. The subject uses the words this guy and not his name Larry. This is an indicator of distancing and that he may not be on good terms at the time of the interview. Time is noted. The length of time is important for the subject to mention and on its own would not conclude positive or negative. What we do know is the linguistic language from the subject towards Larry has been consistently neutral to negative.
There have been times, in fact, where I wish to God we had never met.
The subject pauses. This means he is thinking about what to say or what not to say. In free edited speech, where the subject is giving us his words and not parroting or answering a specific question, we know that the words are theirs. These words give us insight into the subject. Here the subject freely tells us he has, in fact, a negative linguistic disposition to Larry Warren at times. The subject even invokes deity, God. I believe him. I wished to God we had never met. The inclusion of had supports his assertion. Had is past perfect continuous. The subject could have said, I wished to God we never met. Leaving out had would not bring the wish forward in time.
I have been pulled very deeply into this, and at other times I think he's he's certainly one of my dearest friends and somebody I have a great deal of respect for. I think he's extremely...
We need to take a break. We'll be back. Stay with us.
Being pulled. The subject indicates via his words that he is a reluctant player in this. By extension, it tells us he may not have strong self-determination. The subject stutters and pauses at. This could be self-censoring. This is followed with the word well, which is a verbal pause as he decides what to say. Well, he's certainly one of my dearest friends. The subject may be conscious that he hasn't been linguistically kind to Larry, who is sitting beside him, and the pause and self-censoring may be his realization and the need to tell the audience that Larry is his friend. But not only his friend, but certainly one of my dearest. This goes to need to persuade where no need should be required. Conclusions. The subject, Peter Robbins, gives linguistic indicators that he does not have a good relationship with Larry Warren at the time of the interview. This also goes to the time before working with Larry, as is shown in his language. The subject gives indicators that he is not comfortable working with Larry. The language suggests Peter Robbins went along with Larry Warren against his own best interest. He was not coerced to partner with Larry, but unlikely a content participant. The subject indicates with distancing language that he does not have confidence in there having been a UFO sighting and Larry's accounts.